Today I'm speaking with Eleanor Lisney. Eleanor is based over in the UK. She is a campaigner, founder member, public speaker and coordinator of Sisters of Freda, a disabled women's collective. She is an advisor, an aspiring creative practitioner and co-founder of Culture Access CIC, which is about supporting access, bringing an inclusive edge intersectionally. Eleanor was born in Malaysia and she's lived in Strasbourg in France and studied at Austin in Texas. She's written for Media Diversified and is passionate about embedding intersectionality in all her work. She's got 2 grown-up children. Welcome, Eleanor, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really interested in knowing how you got or found yourself being a disability campaigner.
You know, somebody once told me that disability, you have to come out as a disabled person, even if you have a very visible disability or visible impairment. And I think that, so I think I've always not pretended, I was sort of not thought of myself as a disabled person. Well, until I went to university. So I became a campaigner because it just felt natural, you know, because there were things that I had to campaign for, like access and discrimination. I became a campaigner even before I knew I was one. So, yeah. And I think I didn't start being politically a campaigner until I came back to England, because I was too busy just sort of surviving and doing things when I was in France and even when I was in the States. It sounds very rambly. I started going to the sort of disability culture and mixing with disabled people when I just came out of university. But then I got married. Things like that happen to people, and we moved to France, and I was too busy surviving being an expatriate in France where I didn't speak the language, and there was a whole load of things I had to cope with. So yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely. And what about, I mean, more recently you've been a co-founder of Sisters of Freda. You've found yourself in a leadership position in the disability community. How does that leadership role sit with you? How do you work as a leader?
Again, it was sort of by necessity, because I found that there was a gap, because I got a divorce, and there were certain things that I had to deal with, which led me to realize it had a lot to do with the fact that I was a disabled woman. And also I realized that there was a gap between disability organizations and women's organizations, and a lot to do with being a disabled woman, being divorced, because there were a lot of questions that other women couldn't answer because they didn't understand about disability. So I had to find out my own way, and finding Sisters of Freda was something that came out of it. Also because at that time I was asked to speak about domestic violence and disabled women. And the 2 of us, that's my friend Michelle Daly and myself, were invited to speak at Trafalgar Square by the Million Women Rights. And it made a great impression on us. And we then realized that there was nothing for disabled women that had experience or survivors of domestic violence. And so we just sort of roll along with that. And, you know, and if you want to call it being leaders, it was just because no one else was doing it.
Yeah. And
So, yeah.
that's also a big representative moment. You speaking in Trafalgar Square, you're effectively speaking on behalf of disabled women about a particular issue, in this case, domestic violence. How do you make sure that you're representing disabled women, or are you only representing yourself in those situations?
I think we were conscious that we were speaking and representing disabled women because we didn't speak about our own experiences. We did the research and we spoke with the voices of other disabled women, what they have said, and we gave some statistics, we gave some case studies. You know, in the short speech that we did, we mentioned deaf women, we mentioned wheelchair users, etc.
Mm.
So we were conscious that we were speaking for disabled women of different impairments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've also taken that representative role to the United Nations a couple of times. When I first met you, you were involved in the International Network of Women with Disabilities, and you were preparing to be part of a UK coalition of women's organisations going to CEDAW, the Women's Rights Treaty reporting process. So again,
Yeah.
that's a representative role. Clearly, there's only going to be a small number of women going to that on that delegation to the United Nations. How do you again make sure that you, as a disabled woman on that delegation, are representing disabled women in the UK and not just speaking from your own experience?
Do you know, I think because my impairment is so visible, very often I don't even need to open my mouth. And I'm, like it or not, representing disabled women. Sometimes it's very disconcerting because I just want to be myself. But uh, very often I am representing. It's the wheelchair. I think you know the wheelchair is the symbol that sort of represents all impairments. And I know some disabled people don't like that fact, especially people with invisible disabilities. However, I don't think that I've actually gone to something and just wanting to represent myself. In fact, I try to hide my own story, not hide, but I don't really like to talk about too much about personal experiences, except sometimes when it is necessary to talk about your own lived experience to make the story real. If yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
I think everybody has to do that.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so when you're working with Sisters of Freda, that's an organisation of disabled women, and clearly it has a representative role for the disability women's community. You talked earlier about making sure that there was research and statistics and an understanding of various case studies, not just your own. Does Sisters of Freda have that sense of maintaining an understanding of the women that it represents? It really keeps an eye on what's happening. How does it do that?
We try to, but we are very small, so we have a limited capacity. People tell us things, people ask us to represent, people ask us to speak, because at the moment we're still the only disabled women's collective. Um, so we end up getting into all kinds of situations where we are asked to speak about certain things that we don't always know the answers to, because it's all very new. A lot of people, for example, don't know the statistics of, for example, how many women. There's no disaggregated data. That's one thing we keep saying that we need, to make representation, to ask for funding for all sorts of things. But we don't have them. I mean, it's difficult enough to get data on disabled people, and when you ask them about disabled women, it gets very hard. We are hoping that we would be in a position later to do our own research, to set up surveys. But at the moment, we're still learning. And what we learn is, from other women, they come and tell us. We're fortunate in that we have a lot of disabled women who are also academics, who help us, and send us papers when we say, do you have anything? But very often we're asked for these sorts of statistics, and we don't have them. It's not just we don't have them. Disabled people's organizations don't have them. So and we make the point, for example, at the Equality and Human Rights Mission, we said, can we have some funding? How do we get? It's not just representation. How do we get some facts? So like tomorrow morning, first thing tomorrow morning, I'm going to sit in a webinar and learn about the Washington Group statistics and what are they called now, and how do you actually do disability data, that sort of thing. Do you know what? When I first started campaigning, I never knew that I had to go and learn about data sets and yeah. This is the sort of things you find out that you have to learn, because there's nobody else is going to do it if you don't do it.
Absolutely.
I mean, you have to have an idea about how to do something before you can go and ask somebody else to go and do it, because a lot of people don't know what are the indicators. No clue. So yeah, you have to learn. I always say sometimes that doing these things is a bit like running a restaurant. You run a restaurant, but to a certain extent you have to have a certain idea how to cook, because if your chef resigns on you, you still have to be able to do a few dishes, or else you might as well close shop. It's that you have to learn to do everything.
That's a great analogy as a as a frontline activist in a human rights movement. I think that's a really important statement. Many of us find ourselves doing things that we never imagined, and yet we still have to do it within our own ethical space and make sure that we're still advancing the cause that we're committed to. So it can be quite weird sometimes doing things that yeah. So you talk about learning some lessons. What personally are some of the key lessons that you've learned and the tricks that you've learned to be effective as a representative? You talked earlier about, because you have a visible disability, that sometimes is simply enough, is just being in the room. I've also found that one, being in the room, is a really strong thing to do. But what other lessons have you learned along the way to help to push the voice of disabled women, or to push the Sisters of Freda voice?
I think one of the things that I've learned is very often when I first started, I would say, I have no idea what that is about. How can I turn up when I don't know anything? And I sometimes find that that's what I'm saying. Being in that space is important, because very often disability is invisible in the agenda. And being there, even if you know nothing about the subject, asking the question, so why are we not in the agenda? Why don't we know anything about it? What lessons are you telling disabled people? For example, again, tomorrow, I'm being told to go to an international law conference in London. And they have sessions on migrants, they have sessions on minorities, they have sessions on women. And I'm asking the question, but why isn't disability in the program? I don't need to know about the ethics of social justice. I mean, I have an inkling, but I'm not an ex. This is at a university. This is all lawyers and academics, and I don't have a place in those places. What I do there is saying, why is disabled people not here? Why are you not discussing about disability? Is disability not important when you're discussing something like austerity or social justice? Why are we being missed out? And I think that's the sort of trick. For example, again, I give an example. I was asked to go and speak on a program about journalists and the Me Too campaign, and about harassment in the workplace. And I'm self-employed. So I asked, what workplace? I don't work with other people. However, I thought, well, it's important to go along, because then I asked the question as well, are disabled women desexualized? Why are we never, never talked about in these spaces? And to my surprise, they all thought it was a very valid point. I pointed out that a lot of the time sexual harassment is about power. It's not necessarily about sex. So if I think I've lost the gist, but I think the question you asked me is why, the tricks and things like that. I think it's important to be the voice, just be the voice in a place where if you weren't there, then you wouldn't be, then it wouldn't be, the disability wouldn't be spoken about.
Yes, absolutely. And that takes me back to something we did together a few years ago, which was very rushed and but very important, which was responding to the elections of the CRPD committee, the Disability Rights Treaty Committee at the United Nations, which had its election process, and there were no women elected to it.
Yeah.
And I remember you in the middle of the night and me very, very early in the morning, operating on opposite sides of the world, doing a very rapid letter that we could send to our various governments. We had no a specific request from anybody that we worked with, but we worked with a number of women around the world to make sure that we could approach a number of different governments to get that message through, that we needed women elected to the CRPD committee. I'm very proud to say that Australia has now put forward a very strong woman candidate for election in the next Council of States parties. So that's really terrific. Our government got the message. But I remember that particular...
Our government didn't.
Oh, well, that's unfortunate, and
that's also political.
Yes, of course it is. So, but I think the thing that was interesting to me that day is the ability we had to move quickly. So we didn't go back to our groups and seek authority because there was no time, and yet we were acting as representatives of disabled women in our various communities. We were working with a coalition, I think, of about 6 different women at the time. And those different women were in different countries around the world. So when a situation like that arises and we find ourselves acting individually, but we are doing so with the authority of our community, because we are already acting as leaders and representatives. How does that work, do you think? How do we achieve that authority, and how do we make sure that we're not abusing it?
I think that we have to question ourselves that when sometimes in those kind of situations we don't have time to think, but it's all a matter of practice. If every time you do something, you make sure that you consider certain things, then I think it becomes habit. And one of the things that we ask ourselves is it inclusive? Is it intersectional? And to keep all those points, have we forgotten anybody? Are we excluding anybody? So, if you write something, you make sure that you include people with learning difficulties. You include all self-identified women, because there are, Sisters of Freedom make it a point. If you self-identify as a woman, we consider you as a woman, no questions asked. We make sure that we're talking for women of ethnic minorities, women of color. We try and consider everybody, whether you're binary or LGBTQI. So it is that if you have that as a mantra when you're doing anything, then it becomes habit. And I think in that way, you can make sure that you're not just talking from your own privilege. And I mean privilege because I think everybody, even if you're disabled, can speak from a certain privilege point, So if you are conscious of that, then in a way that makes sure that whatever you do would be representational and not just from your own very narrow viewpoint.
Yeah, fantastic. Who is a leader that you admire and why?
A leader? What type of leader?
You tell me.
Well, that's the reason why we are called Sisters of Frida. So obviously, Frida Kahlo, I admire her spirit. Most of all, I admire her spirit. I admire her courage. I admire her creativity. I admire her politics. I admire her independence. And, the fact that she embraces her disability, even though it wasn't called disability at that time. Yeah, so Frida Kahlo is somebody I really, really admire. When it comes to women, I mean, I think there are certain. It's very funny, but some of my heroes are from film. So when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of Chinese kung fu movies, and I said that one time I had to write something about feminism, and I said it's really strange because I was brought up in Malaysia. We didn't know what feminism, but I did go to cinema and I did watch a lot of Chinese kung fu movies, and very often the women in there are the martial artists are very strong characters and powerful. They don't wait for a man to go and pick them up or to marry them, or sometimes they're the people who carry out whatever that needs to be carried out. And I think I learned the qualities a lot from those type of characters, and also from not so much maybe from literature, because I can't think of anybody, even though I did study it as in my master's. I did study the role of women in 17th century literature. Yeah, I do admire the women there, but not in that sort of sense, not in the sort of sense that I admire Frida Kahlo. Not as a
Yeah.
role model for me. Yeah.
No, she's pretty special. We've run out of time. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining the
I hope that was
Disability Leadership
useful.
Institute. Yes, it's been terrific to share leadership and stories. And thanks so much, Eleanor Lisney, for joining us today.
Thank you.